The rooms were warm with gold, but the air felt cold. Behind thick walls and polished doors, a family listened to the world outside begin to turn against them. Flags still flew, bells still rang. Yet something essential had cracked quietly, almost politely. Power was no longer guaranteed. It was being judged. By the early years of the 20th century, Europe stood on the edge of fire. Empires were trembling, crowds were learning the strength of their own voices, and loyalty once inherited like land now had to be earned. Inside the palace, survival demanded a choice no crown was meant to make. Cling to blood or erase it. The cost came first in whispers. Letters went unanswered. Relatives became liabilities. A saret past, once won with pride, began to feel like a dangerous secret. What had taken centuries to build could be undone by a single headline, a single photograph, a single word spoken too honestly. Outside, the public no longer bowed out of habit. They watched. They judged. They remembered. And they asked questions no monarch wanted to answer. Who are you loyal to? What do you really stand for? Why should we still believe in you? By 1917, the fear was no longer abstract. Crowns had already fallen elsewhere. Entire royal families had vanished overnight, and deep within Britain's most powerful household, an irreversible decision was made not to rule more boldly, but to survive at any cost. What followed would preserve the throne but slowly strip away something far harder to reclaim. Welcome to Old Money Chronicles, where we bring you fascinating stories of wealth, ambition, and rivalry from the world's most powerful families. From gilded palaces to private betrayals, we uncover how fortunes were built, defended, and sometimes lost. If you enjoy deep dives into royal scandals, historic power struggles, and hidden legacies, like this video, subscribe and click the bell icon so you never miss a story. Join us as we uncover the legacies that shaped the world of old money. The story of the House of Windsor does not begin with that name, nor even with a deep sense of belonging to Britain. Its roots lie instead in a moment of political calculation, when stability mattered more than affection, and legitimacy mattered more than love. In 1714, the British crown passed to George I, a German prince from the House of Hanover. He was chosen not because he was popular, familiar, or even particularly present, but because he was Protestant and therefore acceptable to Parliament after decades of religious anxiety. This decision secured the state, but it quietly fractured the emotional bond between monarch and people. George I never learned fluent English and relied heavily on German advisors. Court life felt foreign. Royal authority endured, but warmth did not. For much of the 18th century, Britain was ruled by monarchs who were legally legitimate, yet culturally distant. The Hanoverian kings governed through institutions rather than intimacy, allowing Parliament to grow stronger while the crown retreated from daily political life. This shift preserved the monarchy's survival, but at a cost. It slowly transformed the royal family from active rulers into symbolic figures, powerful in name yet increasingly abstract to those they governed. By the early 19th century, this emotional distance had hardened into tradition. Royal life was rigid, formal, and sealed off from ordinary experience. Children were raised for duty rather than affection, educated to rule but not to belong. Marriage was a political act. Emotion was a liability. The crown was not a family inheritance, was a burden passed down intact, generation after generation. Everything began to change in 1837, when an 18-year-old woman ascended the throne. Queen Victoria. Her reign would last more than 60 years and reshape the monarchy's public image more than any before it. Under Victoria, the crown sought moral authority instead of direct political power. Domestic virtue replaced battlefield heroism. The monarchy began to present itself not merely as rulers, but as a model family for a rapidly industrializing nation. Yet even as the image softened, the reality remained severe. In her private correspondence, Queen Victoria frequently acknowledged the emotional distance between the crown and the people. She understood that reverence did not equal affection, and that obedience was not the same as love. The monarchy was respected, even admired, but it was not embraced. This awareness shaped her approach to rule: dignity over popularity, stability over intimacy. Victoria's marriage to Prince Albert further complicated the dynasty's identity. Albert, like the Hanoverian kings before him, was German. He brought administrative reform, cultural patronage, and a disciplined vision of monarchy, but also deepened the crown's foreign associations. At a time when nationalism was tightening across Europe, Britain's royal family remained entangled with continental bloodlines. Cousins ruled rival nations. Family letters crossed borders that would later become battle lines. Under Victoria, the British Empire expanded dramatically, and with it the symbolic power of the monarchy. The crown became an emblem of global reach, presiding over territories it would never see and peoples it would never know. Public ceremonies grew grander. Ritual became essential. Distance, once a weakness, was reframed as majesty. The monarch was elevated above ordinary life, carefully shielded from scandal, emotion, and contradiction. But this elevation carried a hidden cost. As the crown became more symbolic, the individuals who wore it became more constrained. Personal freedom narrowed. Emotional expression was disciplined out of existence. Children were shaped into heirs long before they understood themselves as people. Loyalty to the institution always came first, even when it demanded silence, sacrifice, or some. By the end of the 19th century, the monarchy appeared stronger than ever. It was wealthy, visible, and central to Britain's sense of itself as an imperial power. Yet beneath the surface, its foundations were fragile. The crown's authority rested increasingly on perception rather than power, on respect rather than connection. It endured not because it was loved, but because it seemed necessary. This tension between survival and sincerity, between public grandeur and private costs, was embedded early in the dynasty's DNA. Long before the name Windsor was chosen, the pattern had already formed. Adapt or disappear, endure at the expense of intimacy, rule without ever truly belonging. That legacy would soon be tested in ways the early Hanoverians could never have imagined. When Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, the British monarchy faced a quiet but dangerous problem. It still possessed authority, but it no longer inspired emotional loyalty. Political power had steadily shifted toward Parliament, and the crown risked becoming ornamental, respected, yet increasingly irrelevant. The success of Victoria's reign lay not in reclaiming lost power, but in redefining what royal power meant. From the beginning, Victoria understood that visibility mattered. Her early public appearances were carefully managed to project youth, stability, and moral seriousness. At a time when Britain was undergoing rapid industrialization, IT cities expanding, its social classes shifting, the monarchy offered a sense of continuity. This was not accidental. It was a deliberate recalibration of royal presence, designed to make the crown feel essential even as its direct authority diminished. A defining moment came with Victoria's marriage to Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in 1840. Albert was not merely a consort. He became an architect of the modern monarchy. He pushed for efficiency, education, and reform within the royal household, treating it almost as an institution to be managed rather than a family to be indulged. Prince Albert repeatedly warned that a monarchy disconnected from public life risked resentment. His concern was not theoretical. Across European monarchies were already facing unrest, revolution, and collapse. Together, Victoria and Albert reshaped the monarchy into a moral and cultural symbol. They emphasized domestic virtue, family values, and personal discipline, qualities meant to contrast sharply with earlier perceptions of royal excess. The crown was presented not as distant and indulgent, but as principled and restrained. This shift resonated strongly with Britain's expanding middle class, which increasingly defined national values. The monarchy's transformation into a national symbol was not spontaneous. This shift was carefully staged through public ceremonies, jubilees, and controlled press access. Royal events became spectacles of unity rather than displays of dominance. Newspapers were allowed unprecedented glimpses into royal life, but only carefully curated ones. The public saw devotion, order, and continuity, never conflict or doubt. What appeared as openness was, in reality, disciplined narrative control. Victoria's long reign provided consistency at a time of extraordinary change. Between 1837 and 1901, Britain became the world's dominant imperial power. Railways reshaped geography. Industry reshaped society. The empire expanded across continents. Through it all, the Queen remained a constant presence, less a ruler than a living emblem of British endurance. Her image appeared in colonies she would never visit, binding distant territories to a single symbolic center. The success of this strategy was undeniable. By the mid-19th century, the monarchy enjoyed renewed prestige. Public affection grew, particularly after Albert's death in 1861, when Victoria's prolonged mourning reinforced the image of personal sacrifice and duty. Her withdrawal from public life, initially criticized, eventually deepened sympathy. She appeared less as a sovereign above her people and more as a figure who shared in loss and endurance. Yet these successes carried hidden costs. The monarchy's reliance on symbolism required relentless personal emotion had to serve public purpose. Private suffering was acceptable only if it reinforced collective values. Royal children were raised under immense pressure to embody stability, restraint, and continuity. Individual desires were subordinated to the needs of the institution long before those individuals could fully understand the consequences. Prince Albert's influence, though profound, also deepened the monarchy's vulnerability. His German origins were uncontroversial during much of the 19th century, but they quietly tethered the British crown to continental politics, into marriage among European royal families, creating a web of familial alliances that seemed harmless in peacetime. Cousins married cousins. Letters crossed borders freely. Few imagined that these blood ties would later become liabilities. By the time Victoria's reign neared its end, the monarchy appeared secure, admired, and deeply embedded in British identity. Its public image was one of moral authority and imperial confidence. But beneath that stability lay a growing dependence on perception. The crown's power now rested less on governance, and more on belief that the monarchy represented the nation's best self. This was the paradox Victoria and Albert left behind. A monarchy stronger in symbolism than ever before, yet increasingly fragile if that symbolism were challenged. Its survival depended on maintaining dignity, unity, and restraint at all costs. Any fracture, any scandal, foreign association, or moral failure risked exposing how little room remained for error. The decisions that brought the monarchy its 19th century success also narrowed its future choices. It had learned how to be admired but not how to be questioned, and in the century to come, questions would arrive with unprecedented force. The death of Queen Victoria in 1901 marked more than the end of a long reign. It signaled a transition into a new and uncertain era. Britain entered the 20th century as the world's most powerful empire. Yet the monarchy that symbolized this dominance faced pressures unlike any it had encountered before. Industrial progress, political reform, and mass communication were reshaping how power was perceived. To survive, the crown had to expand its influence, not through authority, but through presence. Victoria's successor, Edward VII, represented a deliberate shift in style. Where his mother had embodied restraint and moral severity, Edward embraced visibility, sociability, and public engagement. He understood instinctively that the monarchy could no longer remain distant if it wished to retain relevance. Appearances mattered more than proclamations. Perception, more than policy, became the true currency of royal power. This period coincided with rapid changes in media. Advances in photography and mass newspapers transformed royals into recognizable public figures for the first time. Images of the king and his family circulated widely, reaching homes far beyond London and even beyond Britain itself. For the monarchy, this was both an opportunity and a risk. Visibility created familiarity, but familiarity also invited scrutiny. The crown could inspire loyalty on a scale never before possible. It could also provoke criticism, just as Edward VII leaned into this transformation. He appeared frequently at public events, diplomatic gatherings, and social functions, positioning the monarchy at the center of elite and international life. His reign helped normalize the idea that royalty could be seen, photographed, and discussed without losing its mystique. In doing so, he reinforced the monarchy's role as a unifying symbol during a time of rapid change. Internationally, royal influence expanded through blood as much as diplomacy. The British royal family was deeply interconnected with Europe's ruling houses. Cousins occupied thrones in Germany, Russia, Denmark, and beyond. These familial networks appeared to strengthen Britain's position, creating informal channels of influence that complemented official diplomacy. Royal marriages were treated as stabilizing forces, binding nations together through shared lineage. Yet this interconnectedness masked a growing vulnerability. As nationalism intensified across Europe, foreign bloodlines began to look less like assets and more like liabilities. What had once been a symbol of unity among monarchs increasingly clashed with rising popular identities. The British crown, still rooted in German lineage, relied on tradition to justify its position, but tradition alone was losing persuasive power. At home, the monarchy's symbolic reach expanded alongside the empire itself. Royal ceremonies accompanied imperial milestones. Portraits of the king appeared in colonies thousands of miles away. Loyalty to the crown became synonymous with loyalty to Britain. The monarchy no longer governed the empire directly, but it legitimized it. The crown's image gave coherence to a vast and uneven imperial system, linking distant territories to a shared symbolic center. This expansion of influence was carefully managed. Access to royal life was controlled, appearances choreographed, narratives curated. The monarchy learned to operate within the logic of mass perception without surrendering authority. What the public saw was stability, confidence, and continuity. What it did not see were doubts, disagreements, or fears that increasingly shaped decision-making behind palace walls. By 1910, the crown passed to George V, whose temperament contrasted sharply with his father's. George V was cautious, dutiful, and acutely aware of the monarchy's fragility. He inherited a throne that appeared strong but rested on delicate foundations. Democratic reforms were accelerating. The House of Lords faced limitations. Political power continued to shift away from hereditary authority. George V responded by reinforcing discipline and tradition. If the monarchy could no longer command obedience, it would demand respect. Public rituals became more rigid, symbolism more carefully preserved. The royal family closed ranks, emphasizing unity and continuity above all else. The crown presented itself as timeless even as the world around it moved rapidly forward. Beneath this controlled exterior, anxiety grew. European tensions were rising. Alliances hardened. Newspapers that once celebrated royalty now questioned it. The same media that elevated the crown also amplified criticism. The monarchy's expansion into public life had bound its survival to public opinion in ways that could not easily be reversed. By 1914, as Europe stood on the brink of war, the British monarchy had reached a paradoxical peak. Its visibility was unmatched. Its symbolic power stretched across a global empire. Its image was deeply embedded in national identity, and yet, its margin for error had never been smaller. The expansion of royal power during this period did not come through conquest or command, but through adaptation. The monarchy learned how to be seen, how to be staged, how to be believed in. But in doing so, it also surrendered a degree of insulation. Once the crown entered the public imagination so fully, it could no longer retreat without consequence. The success of these years masked a looming truth. The monarchy's power now depended entirely on trust, and trust, once shaken, would prove far more difficult to reclaim than territory or titles. The first true rupture did not begin inside the palace, it began in the streets. The newspapers, and the uneasy silence that followed Britain's declaration of war in August 1914. Europe had fractured along alliance lines, and for the first time in generations, blood ties between royal families were no longer symbols of unity. They were liabilities. Britain entered the First World War against Germany with confidence in its military power, but uncertainty at its symbolic core. The ruling dynasty was still unmistakably German in origin. Surnames, titles, and ancestral connections that had once seemed distant or irrelevant now felt dangerously close to the enemy. As young men marched to enlist, questions spread rapidly. Not about strategy or sacrifice, but about loyalty. British newspapers openly questioned why English soldiers should fight under a German-born dynasty. The tone was not revolutionary, but corrosive, skeptical, suspicious, and and increasingly bold. Editorials contrasted patriotic sacrifice at the front with foreign ancestry at the top. What had once been politely ignored became openly discussed. The monarchy, long shielded by tradition and reverence, found itself exposed to public scrutiny in a way it had never experienced. For George Gibe, the war triggered a profound personal and institutional crisis. He was not only Britain's king, but also a cousin of Germany's Kaiser, Wilhelm II. Family letters that once carried affection now represented embarrassment. Shared childhood memories became politically dangerous. The war forced a brutal separation between private identity and public duty. The tension intensified as anti-German sentiment spilled into daily life. German street names were changed. German businesses were vandalized. Even the royal family's residences, some bearing Germanic titles, drew uncomfortable attention. The monarchy had not changed, but the context around it had transformed overnight. What had been tolerable in peace became unacceptable in war. Inside the palace, fear replaced complacency. The collapse of long-standing monarchies elsewhere in Europe loomed large. The Russian royal family, closely related to Britain's, faced growing unrest that would soon turn catastrophic. The lesson was clear and terrifying. Crowns were no longer protected by tradition alone. Public anger, once unleashed, could sweep away centuries of rule in months. This was the true beginning of the rivalry, not between families, but between the crown and public trust. The monarchy had always relied on distance to preserve authority. Now that distance was interpreted as indifference, even disloyalty. The same symbolic detachment that once elevated the crown now threatened to isolate it fatally. George V understood that silence was no longer neutral. Doing nothing risked allowing suspicion to harden into resentment. Yet acting too openly risked drawing further attention to the very foreignness the crown hoped to minimize. Every choice carried danger. Every delay magnified uncertainty. What made this conflict especially destabilizing was its emotional nature. This was not a dispute over policy or power, but over identity. Was the monarchy truly British or merely ruling Britain? That question, once whispered at the margins, had entered the mainstream. By the end of 1914, the war had claimed thousands of lives, and the monarchy's sense of security had quietly vanished. The crown still stood. The rituals remained intact, but beneath the surface, something essential had shifted. Trust once inherited now had to be proven, and the longer the war dragged on, the more urgent that proof would become. As the war ground on into 1915, the initial shock of conflict hardened into something more corrosive. What had begun as unease became sustained suspicion, fed daily by casualty lists, shortages, and an increasingly impatient press. The longer the war lasted, the more the public searched for symbols to blame and the monarchy. Once sacrosanct was no longer beyond reach. Inside Britain, anti-German sentiment intensified to the point of ritual. Street names rang. Schools stopped teaching German. Even popular music and food was scrutinized for foreign associations. The atmosphere was not merely patriotic, it was purifying. In such a climate, the royal family's ancestry could not remain an abstraction. Each reminder of continental bloodlines landed like an accusation. For George V, the years 1915 to 1917 were marked by mounting anxiety. Privately, George V reportedly feared that the fate of the Russian monarchy could easily become Britain's own. The concern was not melodramatic. Across Europe, thrones were shaking. Popular unrest, fueled by war exhaustion and economic strain, was eroding the foundations of hereditary rule. Fear replaced confidence. Palace security was increased, public appearances reduced, and internal discussions turned openly to survival. The monarchy began to behave less like an institution assured of permanence, and more like one bracing for impact. Decisions were filtered through a single question. Will this help us endure? The Russian situation weighed especially heavily on the king. Tsar Nicholas II, George V's cousin, ruled under conditions strikingly similar to Britain's imperial overstretch, public dissatisfaction, and wartime pressure. Yet, Russia lacked Britain's constitutional buffers. By 1916, reports from St. Petersburg described unrest bordering on collapse. What terrified the British court was not Russia's difference, but its resemblance. If revolution could sweep away a centuries-old dynasty there, it could happen anywhere. Meanwhile, the British press grew bolder. Cartoons and editorials questioned the relevance of monarchy in a modern, democratic society fighting a total war. The idea that sacrifice was unevenly shared gained traction. Soldiers died in trenches while royalty remained protected behind palace walls. The monarchy's symbolic distance, once a strength now, risked appearing like detachment. The war also strained the monarchy's internal relationships. European cousins who had once exchanged letters and visited freely were now enemies. Communication ceased. Family loyalty became politically dangerous. The king's every gesture was scrutinized for hints of divided allegiance. Neutrality was impossible. Overcompensation became necessary. In response, the crown leaned harder into displays of George V made visible efforts to associate himself with soldiers and workers, visiting factories, hospitals, and frontline units. These appearances were sincere, but they were also strategic. Each photograph, each reported visit, served as evidence proof that the monarchy shared in the nation's struggle. Yet, even these gestures carried risk. Visibility invited criticism. Absence suggested indifference. The monarchy found itself trapped between two dangers, its margin for error narrowing by the month. What it needed was a decisive act, something that would sever doubt at its source rather than merely manage it. By 1917, the warning signs multiplied. The Russian Revolution erupted, dismantling the Romanov dynasty with shocking speed and violence. News of the Tsar's downfall spread through European courts like a chill. Royal families everywhere understood the message. Bloodline and tradition offered no immunity. Public tolerance had limits, and war had pushed many societies past them. For the British monarchy, this was the moment when abstract fear crystallized into urgency. The crown could no longer rely on incremental gestures or symbolic reassurance. The problem was structural, rooted in identity itself. As long as the dynasty's name, titles, and lineage pointed back to Germany, suspicion would persist no matter how loyal the king's actions. The rivalry between crown and public trust had now fully emerged. It was not loud or theatrical, but it was relentless. Every day the war continued without resolution. The monarchy's position weakened slightly. Every report from Russia sharpened the sense of impending danger. Survival, once assumed, now required reinvention. By the end of 1917, the monarchy stood at a crossroads. One path led toward continuity, through transformational admission that symbolism had to change in order for the institution to live. The other path led toward stubborn preservation, clinging to lineage and risking collapse. The choice would come swiftly, and unchanging would alter the royal family's identity forever. By 1917, the British monarchy no longer had the luxury of gradual adjustment. The war had entered its most exhausting phase. Public patience was thinning, and the collapse of the Russian monarchy had transformed anxieties into urgency. The question confronting the crown was no longer whether change was desirable, but whether it was unavoidable. Survival now depended on a decisive break with the past one that would be visible, symbolic, and immediately understood by the public. The problem was identity. However loyal George V's actions had been, the dynasty's name still tethered the monarchy to Germany. In a total war defined by nationalism, symbolism carried extraordinary weight. Names, titles, and appearances mattered as much as military victories. As long as the royal house bore a German designation, suspicion could never be fully neutralized. On July 17, 1917, the king issued a royal proclamation that would quietly redefine the monarchy's future. The House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was formally abandoned. In its place, the dynasty adopted a new name, House of Windsor. Chosen for its association with English history and continuity, Windsor evoked permanence, familiarity, and national rootedness. It was a name that sounded immovable ancient stone rather than continental blood. The change was immediate and sweeping. German titles were relinquished. Relatives were stripped of honors. The monarchy's public-facing identity was rebuilt almost overnight. German identity was symbolically aristo bloodlines, of course, remained unchanged. Biology could not be altered, but perception could. And perception was now the monarchy's most valuable asset. Public reaction was largely positive. Newspapers praised the decision as prudent and patriotic. The renaming offered reassurance that the crown understood the mood of the nation and was willing to adapt. For many Britons, the act resolved an unease they had struggled to articulate. The monarchy now appeared unmistakably British, not just in loyalty, but in name. Yet the triumph was not without cost. The decision fractured families and humiliated relatives who had done nothing personally wrong. Cousins who had once shared royal privilege found themselves cast aside, their titles dissolved by decree. Loyalty to the crown was rewarded. Proximity to the wrong ancestry was punished. The monarchy survived by narrowing its definition of belonging. Internally, the change marked a psychological turning point. The royal family had crossed a line from adaptation into self-reinvention. This was not merely a public relations maneuver. It was an admission that lineage alone no longer conferred legitimacy. Acceptance had to be earned continuously, and the crown would reshape itself to meet public expectations. The adoption of the Windsor name also recalibrated the monarchy's relationship with society. It signaled a shift away from pan-European royal identity toward a distinctly national one. The crown was no longer the apex of a network of royal cousins. It was the symbolic embodiment of the British state. This narrowed focus strengthened domestic support but weakened traditional royal solidarity across borders. Social acceptance followed, but it was conditional. The public embraced the change because it aligned with wartime values: sacrifice, unity, and clarity of allegiance. Yet the episode subtly altered expectations. If the monarchy could change its name to survive, what else might it be asked to surrender in the future? The precedent had been set. Adaptation was no longer exceptional, it was expected. For Georges, the success of the renaming brought relief, but not comfort. He had preserved the throne, but at the expense of continuity. The monarchy's authority now rested squarely on public consent rather than inherited inevitability. The crown remained, but it stood on negotiated ground. The change also deepened internal discipline. If survival depended on image, then behavior had to be controlled with unprecedented rigor. Private lives were further constrained. Emotional expression was subordinated to institutional necessity. The royal family learned that any deviation, any hint of scandal or divided loyalty cooled everything they had just secured. This battle for status was therefore not a single victory, but the beginning of a new struggle. The monarchy had won acceptance, but only by aligning itself closely with national sentiment. That alignment would have to be maintained relentlessly across generations, regardless of personal cost. In the short term, the strategy worked. The House of Windsor emerged from the war intact, respected, and symbolically renewed. While other European dynasties fell, Britain's monarchy endured. The crown appeared resilient, adaptive, and essential proof that tradition could survive modernity if it bent at the right moment. But beneath the success lay a quieter transformation. The monarchy had learned to fear public opinion, to anticipate it, and to shape itself around it. Identity had become a performance. Continuity had become conditional. The crown was no longer protected by distance. It was bound to visibility and approval. By the end of 1917, the rivalry between crown and public trust had settled into an uneasy truce. The monarchy had proven its willingness to change, and the public, for now, accepted the gesture. Yet the balance was fragile. The very act that saved the dynasty had also exposed its vulnerability. The House of Windsor had been born out of necessity, not celebration. It carried within it the lesson of that moment. Survival would always come first, even if it meant abandoning parts of itself along the way. That lesson would shape every crisis to come. By the early 1930s, the House of Windsor appeared stable on the surface. Yet the foundations laid during the First World War had quietly reshaped its inner logic. Survival now depended on discipline, image control, and emotional restraint. The monarchy had learned that public trust could vanish quickly and that regaining it required sacrifice. This lesson would define every expectation placed upon the next king. The global context was unforgiving. The Great Depression deepened social inequality and eroded faith in elites across Europe. Monarchies elsewhere had already fallen or been reduced to ceremonial shells. In Britain, the crown endured largely because it was seen as restrained, dutiful, and morally serious. Any hint of indulgence or personal excess risked undoing decades of careful rehabilitation. When George V, aged and his health declined, attention turned to his heir, Edward VIII. Edward had been Prince of Wales for more than 20 years, and was widely admired for his charm, confidence, and modern outlook. He dressed differently, spoke more casually, and appeared more emotionally accessible than previous heirs. To many, he represented a monarchy finally in step with the 20th century. Inside the palace, however, Edward inspired unease. He had absorbed the visibility of modern royalty but resisted its discipline. Advisors worried about his impatience with routine, his discomfort with constraint, and his tendency to place personal desire above institutional expectation. The crown no longer belonged to the individual who wore it. It belonged to the public imagination. Edward seemed unwilling or unable to accept that distinction fully. The tension was not yet public, but it was well understood within royal circles. The monarchy's post-1917 survival strategy required predictability and emotional control. Edward's behavior introduced uncertainty. He favored private judgment over protocol, intimacy over distance. These traits made him popular, but popularity, the court knew, was unstable. Respect was safer. As Europe drifted toward ideological extremism, the stakes grew higher. Authoritarian leaders exploited spectacle and emotion, reshaping public loyalty through mass appeal. In this environment, Britain's monarchy could not afford ambiguity. It had to stand for restraint, not impulse; continuity, not individual preference. By 1935, George V was increasingly concerned about the future of the crown. He understood that the monarchy's strength rested not on affection alone, but on moral authority. The next king would inherit not only a throne, but an unspoken mandate: never place personal happiness above national stability. When George V died in January 1936, Edward ascended the throne amid genuine public goodwill. Crowds welcomed him enthusiastically. Newspapers praised his modernity. Yet behind the scenes, palace officials moved cautiously. The crown had been saved once by symbolic reinvention. It might not survive another miscalculation. What few outside the inner circle grasped was how narrow the margin for error had become. The monarchy had bound itself tightly to public approval, and public approval had conditions. The king's private life was no longer private. His choices would be interpreted as statements about the institution itself. As 1936 unfolded, the stage was set not for a sudden scandal, but for a collision between two incompatible forces: a monarchy built on sacrifice, and a king unwilling to live without personal fulfillment. The planning was not deliberate, but the consequences were inevitable. The House of Windsor had survived war, suspicion, and reinvention. It now faced a different threat, one that came not from crowds or enemies, but from within. The confrontation arrived not as a sudden explosion, but as a slow, tightening bind. By early 1936, Edward VIII had been king for only months, yet the private tensions surrounding him were already impossible to contain. His relationship with Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, was no longer a matter of rumor within court circles. It was the axis upon which the future of the monarchy would turn. For Edward, the relationship was deeply personal and non-negotiable. He saw Wallis as emotional refuge and intellectual equal, someone who offered clarity in a life dominated by ritual and constraint. To him, the crown had always felt inherited rather than chosen, an obligation imposed long before consent could be given. Love, in contrast, felt voluntary, authentic, in a way kingship never had. For the institution, however, the relationship was intolerable. As head of the Church of England, the king could not marry a woman with 2 living ex-husbands without provoking a constitutional crisis. More dangerously, the monarchy's carefully rebuilt moral authority, painstakingly restored after the First World War, was now at risk. The crown had survived by embodying restraint. Edward embodied defiance. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin made the position of the government unmistakably clear. Britain would not accept Wallis Simpson as queen, nor would the Dominions. The monarchy, already dependent on public trust, could not afford a fracture across the empire. What appeared to Edward as a personal matter was, in reality, a test of institutional limits. As discussions intensified, the emotional divide widened. Edward framed the issue as one of personal freedom versus outdated convention. His advisors framed it as duty versus indulgence. Each side spoke a different moral language. No compromise satisfied both. A morganatic marriage was proposed and rejected. Delay only increased press speculation. Silence became impossible. The British press, restrained by agreement, initially avoided full coverage. But foreign newspapers did not. Stories circulated across Europe and America, then filtered back into Britain through whispers and imported headlines. Once the public learned the truth, curiosity hardened into judgment. The king's private life was now a national spectacle. Inside the royal family, the crises cut deeply. Edward's brother, George VI, watched with growing dread. He understood what was at stake. Not only the throne, but the fragile trusts the monarchy had rebuilt through sacrifice and self-denial. The family's survival strategy left no room for personal exception. If Edward chose love over duty, the consequences would extend far beyond himself. By December 1936, the situation had reached its breaking point. Edward faced three options: abandon the relationship, defy constitutional advice, or relinquish the crown. Each carried irreversible loss. To remain king meant surrendering the one relationship that made the role bearable. To insist on marriage meant dragging the monarchy into open conflict with government and empire. The final option, abdication, offered personal freedom at institutional cost. Edward chose abdication. On December 11, 1936, he addressed the nation by radio. His voice was calm, almost relieved. He explained that he could not carry the burden of kingship without the support of the woman he loved. The language was measured, but the implications were seismic. For the first time in British history, a reigning monarch had voluntarily stepped aside for personal reasons. Public reaction was conflicted. Some admired his honesty, others felt betrayed. Many were simply stunned. The crown, long portrayed as a permanent fixture, had been revealed as conditional, dependent on individual choice after all. The monarchy survived the moment, but the illusion of inevitability did not. The immediate consequences were swift. Edward became the Duke of Windsor and left Britain, entering a form of emotional and political exile. His brother ascended the throne reluctantly, burdened by responsibility he had never sought. The royal family closed ranks, tightening discipline even further. Personal happiness was now explicitly subordinate to institutional stability. The confrontation had reached its conclusion, but the damage was lasting. The abdication exposed the monarchy's central paradox. It demanded human sacrifice to preserve a symbolic ideal, yet it relied on human beings to embody that ideal convincingly. Edward's refusal to comply forced the institution to choose survival over compassion. In doing so, the House of Windsor preserved the crown, but at the cost of warmth, trust within the family, and any lingering illusion that love and power could comfortably coexist. The line between private life and public duty was no longer blurred. It was sealed shut. Nothing that followed would ever be quite the same. The abdication of Edward VIII did not conclude the crisis. It redistributed its weight. What had been a personal confrontation became an institutional reckoning, one whose consequences unfolded slowly and relentlessly over the next decade and a half. The monarchy survived, but it did so by hardening itself, reshaping expectations, and accepting losses it would never publicly acknowledge. Edward's departure was swift and deliberate. Granted the title Duke of Windsor, he left Britain soon after abdication, beginning a life of permanent displacement. Though officially treated with courtesy, he was effectively removed from influence, ritual, and belonging. Invitations were limited. Access was controlled. The message was unmistakable. Survival required distance. The monarchy could not afford ambiguity, and Edward embodied too much of it. Privately, resentment lingered. Edward believed he had been cornered by an inflexible system unwilling to evolve. The royal family, in turn, viewed his choice as a betrayal not only of duty, but of the collective discipline that had preserved the crown through war and suspicion. What had once been a family became a divided institution, bound by silence rather than affection. The immediate burden fell upon Edward's brother, George VI, a man never trained to be king, shy, physically fragile, and plagued by a debilitating stammer. George VI ascended the throne under immense pressure. He inherited not confidence, but fear that another misstep could undo everything the monarchy had regained since 1917. George VI's reign was defined by duty rather than ambition. He embraced the crown not because he desired it, but because refusal was unthinkable. This sense of obligation resonated with a public weary of excess and spectacle. In contrast to his brother's defiance, George's restraint reassured. The monarchy had chosen continuity over charisma, stability over individuality. As Europe moved toward another war, the abdication's shadow deepened. The monarchy could no longer risk appearing indulgent or detached. During the Second World War, George VI and his wife, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, deliberately remained in London during the Blitz, sharing the dangers faced by ordinary citizens. This decision was not merely symbolic, it was corrective. The crown needed to prove that it would endure hardship alongside the nation. Public truths, shaken by Edward's abdication, gradually recovered through visible sacrifice. The king's quiet persistence contrasted sharply with his brother's absence. Where Edward had chosen personal fulfillment, George embodied collective endurance. The monarchy reframed itself once again not as glamorous or romantic, but as steadfast and reliable. Edward, meanwhile, drifted further from relevance. His visits to Europe during the war, including controversial interactions with German officials, deepened suspicion and ensured his permanent exclusion from meaningful royal life, whether motivated by naivety, resentment, or a lingering desire for importance. His actions reinforced the palace's belief that abdication had been necessary. Within the royal family, the abdication became a cautionary tale, repeated silently rather than discussed openly. Future heirs were shaped by its lesson. Desire must never outrank duty. Personal vulnerability was dangerous. Emotional openness invited risk. The monarchy did not articulate these rules publicly, but it enforced them rigorously behind closed doors. The long-term consequence was cultural. The House of Windsor grew increasingly controlled, disciplined, and emotionally distant. The abdication had revealed that even kings were replaceable if they threatened institutional survival. Individuality was tolerated only insofar as it served the crown's image. Anything more was treated as decent. By the time Elizabeth II ascended the throne in 19, the monarchy she inherited was fundamentally altered by her uncle's choice. It had learned how close it could come to collapse and how much it was willing to sacrifice to prevent it. Elizabeth was trained not to reign boldly, but to endure quietly. Her role was not to redefine the monarchy, but to stabilize it indefinitely. The abdication also changed how the public perceived the crown. The idea that monarchy was automatic, inevitable, or divinely anchored had been quietly dismantled. What remained was a contract unspoken but understood. The monarchy would remain so long as it placed national stability above personal fulfillment. This was the true aftermath of 1936. The crown survived intact, but something vital had been surrendered in the process. The royal family had chosen survival over intimacy, continuity over compassion. The price was not measured in titles or territory, but in relationships that would never fully heal. Edward lived on, separated from the institution he once embodied, a reminder of what happened when the crown was challenged from within. George VI ruled on, burdened by responsibility he never sought, and the House of Windsor moved forward stronger in structure, weaker in warmth. The monarchy had crossed its point of no return. It would endure, but it would never again pretend that love and power could peacefully coexist. In the years following the abdication, the House of Windsor entered a period defined less by outward drama than by inward reckoning. The crown had survived its most intimate crises, but it had not emerged unchanged. What followed was a quieter, struggled one, fought not in headlines, but in discipline, restraint, and the constant effort to hold together an institution now fully aware of its own fragility. For your sixth kingship was never a source of pride. It was an obligation accepted under duress. Every public appearance, every speech, every decision carried the weight of comparison with his brother's charisma. With the monarchy's near collapse, with the knowledge that the crown could no longer afford error, his reign became an exercise in endurance rather than assertion. The Second World War transformed this internal struggle into a public test. As bombs fell on London and morale wavered, the monarchy faced a defining choice: remain symbolically elevated, or share visibly in the nation's suffering. George VI chose proximity. He and his family stayed in the capital during the Blitz, refusing evacuation. Palaces were damaged, risk was real. Yet this decision restored something the abdication had threatened to destroy. These wartime years forged a new moral compact between crown and people. The monarchy no longer asked for reverence, it offered solidarity. George VI's limitations, his stammer, his anxiety, his visible strain made him relatable in a way earlier monarchs had never been. He did not command affection through glamour, but through persistence. The crown's authority was rebuilt, not through spectacle, but through shared endurance. Privately, however, the cost was severe. The king's health deteriorated under constant pressure. Smoking, stress, and exhaustion took their toll. The monarchy's survival strategy demanded emotional containment, leaving little space for vulnerability. Even within the family, conversations were cautious. The abdication remained unspoken but omnipresent, a reminder of what failure looked like. As the war ended and Britain emerged victorious yet diminished, the monarchy faced a new reality. Empire was receding. Deference was eroding. The crown could no longer rely on imperial grandeur to justify its place. Instead, it leaned fully into continuity. Stability became its final defense. During this period, the future of the monarchy was already being shaped in the figure of Elizabeth II, though she had not yet ascended the throne. Trained meticulously, she absorbed the lessons of her father's reign and her uncle's failure. Duty was not merely emphasized, it was internalized. Emotion was disciplined early. Privacy was narrowed. The crown was presented not as an aspiration, but as a lifelong obligation. George VI understood that his greatest contribution would not be reform, but preparation. He could not afford innovation. The monarchy had learned that boldness invited instability. What it needed now was someone who could embody restraint indefinitely. Elizabeth was molded accordingly, not to shine, but to endure. When George VI died in 1952, the transition was smooth, almost ritualistic. There was no crisis, no uncertainty. That, in itself, was the victory. The monarchy had learned to suppress drama, to neutralize potential fractures before they surfaced. The final battle of this era was not against enemies or ideology, but against chaos itself. Yet, beneath the calm transfer of power lay unresolved tension. The crown had become exceptionally resilient but also emotionally sealed. Survival had required control, and control had reshaped the institutions in her life. The monarchy no longer risked collapse through scandal, but it risked something quieter: disconnection. By 1952, the House of Windsor stood intact, disciplined, and publicly trusted once more. But it carried with it the accumulated weight of choices, made under pressure choices, that privileged stability over sincerity, endurance over openness. These were not temporary adjustments. They were permanent features of a monarchy, determined never to come so close to the edge again. The crown had survived its trials. The question that remained unasked, but unresolved, was what such survival had already cost, and what it would continue to demand in the years ahead. When Elizabeth II ascended the throne in 1952, the House of Windsor entered its longest and most symbolically complex chapter. The new queen inherited not only a crown, but an unspoken mandate shaped by abdication, war, and survival, never become the story. Her reign would be defined less by decisive events than by the careful management of continuity in a world that was rapidly shedding tradition. From the beginning, Elizabeth understood that modern monarchy rested on symbolism rather than command. Britain was no longer an unquestioned imperial power. Colonies sought independence. Class structures soft. Deference declined. The crown could no longer rely on authority. It had to embody permanence. Elizabeth's greatest strength lay in her consistency. She offered the public an unchanging figure amid accelerating change. This consistency was reinforced through ritual. Coronations, jubilees, state openings of parliament, and carefully choreographed tours became the monarchy's primary language. These were not empty traditions. They were strategic acts of reassurance. Each ceremony communicated endurance, order, and stability. The monarchy did not explain itself. It presented itself. Physical symbols reinforced this message. Palaces, uniforms, regalia, and ceremonies were preserved with near-religious precision. Even as Britain modernized, the monarchy appeared timeless. This contrast became its greatest asset. In an age of uncertainty, the crown offered familiarity. The media played a central role in transforming these symbols into shared national experiences. Elizabeth II became the first monarch whose coronation was televised, bringing the spectacle of monarchy into ordinary homes. This moment marked a recalibration rather than an opening. The public was allowed to see more, but only what reinforced stability. Access was expanded, but control remained absolute. Over the decades, royal milestones, marriages, births, jubilees became collective rituals. They offered moments of unity in an increasingly fragmented society. Yet this visibility came with an invisible discipline. Personal emotion was carefully managed. Private conflict was concealed. The monarchy learned to perform openness without surrendering privacy. At the heart of this strategy was Elizabeth's personal restraint. She rarely expressed political opinions, emotional reactions, or personal grievances. Silence became a form of authority. In a world where leaders spoke constantly, the Queen's reserve signaled neutrality and permanence. The crown positioned itself above controversy by refusing to engage with it. This approach succeeded institutionally, but it carried consequences. The monarchy's reliance on symbolism required emotional distance. Family members were expected to conform to roles rather than explore identities. The crown functioned smoothly, but relationships within it were often strained by expectation and scrutiny. By the late 20th century, this tension became increasingly visible. Royal marriages faltered under pressure. The contrast between public pageantry and private unhappiness grew harder to ignore. The monarchy's symbols remained powerful, but they began to feel disconnected from lived reality. Still, the endurance of Elizabeth II's reign cannot be overstated. Through political upheaval, economic crises, and cultural transformation, the monarchy remained a constant presence. Its survival was not accidental. It was the result of lessons learned the hard way, most notably. That adaptability must be subtle, and emotion must never outrun structure. The symbols of the House of Windsor during this era were not monuments of conquest, but of continuity. They did not celebrate power. They preserved it. Each ritual, each ceremony, each carefully released image reinforced the same message. The monarchy endures because it does not change visibly, even as everything around it does. Yet beneath the polished surface, the cost accumulated. The crown's identity became inseparable from performance. Authenticity was subordinated to expectation. The monarchy succeeded in remaining relevant, but only by narrowing the space in which its members could be human. By the year 2000, the House of Windsor stood as one of the last surviving great dynasties of Europe. Its symbols were intact. Its rituals still commanded attention. Its monarch remained respected worldwide. But the gap between public image and private experience had widened dramatically. The monuments of this era were not only palaces and ceremonies. They were habits of restraint, traditions of silence, and an institutional memory shaped by fear of collapse. The monarchy had mastered survival through symbolism, but in doing so, it had bound itself to an image that could never fully reflect the lives lived behind it. These enduring moments secured the crown's place in modern Britain. They also set the stage for the reckoning that would follow, when silence itself would be tested. By the 1990s, the House of Windsor entered a phase that could no longer be managed through symbolism alone. The structures built to ensure survival, silence, restraint, controlled visibility were now colliding with a media environment that rewarded exposure and punished secrecy. The monarchy was not collapsing, but it was changing in ways that could not be fully directed from within palace walls. The decade opened with mounting strain inside the royal family. Marriages that had once been celebrated as fairy tales deteriorated under public scrutiny. Separation, infidelity, and emotional isolation became impossible to conceal. The monarchy's long-standing strategy present unity. Concealed fracture began to fail as private pain spilled into public view. This tension reached its most devastating moment in 1997 with the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. Her death did more than shock the nation. It exposed a profound disconnect between royal protocol and public emotion. In the days that followed, the monarchy's silenced, once a symbol of dignity, was interpreted as coldness. Crowds gathered, not in deference, but in grief and anger. The crown's emotional distance, carefully cultivated for decades, suddenly looked like indifference. The response marked a turning point. The monarchy adapted visibly and under pressure. Public statements were made. Emotional language was permitted. The palace adjusted its posture toward openness, not as a strategic choice, but as a necessity. Trust, once assumed, now had to be actively maintained. This period revealed a deeper truth about what had been lost. The monarchy did not lose its crown, but it lost the freedom to exist as a private family. From this point forward, personal lives were no longer merely constrained. They were permanently exposed. Every relationship, conflict, or failure became part of a public narrative beyond royal control. Into the 21st century, this exposure intensified. Digital media accelerated scrutiny. Deference continued to erode. The monarchy remained respected, but it was no longer insulated. Its authority rested increasingly on transparency and responsiveness, qualities fundamentally at odds with the distance that had once preserved it. Younger generations of royals navigated this landscape with uneven success. Some embraced visibility, attempting to modernize the institution through accessibility and openness. Others recoiled, viewing constant exposure as incompatible with dignity or mental well-being. These divergent responses created new internal tensions, less about loyalty to crown than about survival within it. Public debates shifted accordingly. The question was no longer whether Britain needed a monarchy, but what kind of monarchy it was willing to tolerate. Cost, relevance, accountability, all were openly discussed. The crown endured these debates largely intact, but its position was no longer unquestioned. What emerged was not a collapse, but a narrowing. The monarchy's role became more symbolic, its authority more conditional. It survived through adaptation, yet each adaptation reduced its autonomy. The institution remained powerful but less free. In T's Sensei, the House of Windsor did not lose everything in a dramatic fall. Instead, it lost something quieter and more enduring: control over its own boundaries. The line between public duty and private life, once rigidly enforced, dissolved under relentless observation. Survival now required constant negotiation with public expectation. By the present day, the monarchy stands as a paradox. It is one of the world's most recognizable institutions, yet one of the most constrained. It commands attention, but little privacy. It symbolizes continuity, but lives under perpetual revision. Its crown remains, but the conditions of wearing it have fundamentally changed. The transformation is complete. The House of Windsor survives not because it is untouchable, but because it has learned again and again how to bend without breaking. What it lost was not power in the traditional sense, but the human latitude that once existed behind palace walls. The legacy of this era is clear. Endurance has been achieved, but at a permanent cost. The monarchy remains, but only as long as it continues to meet expectations it did not create and can never fully escape. The story of the House of Windsor is not one of conquest or collapse, but of endurance shaped by fear. Power was gained, not through domination, but through adaptation, through an acute awareness that crowns could fall as easily as governments if public trust. Again and again, the monarchy chose survival over sentiment, continuity over comfort. What was won? Clear. The crown endured when others vanished. While Europe's great dynasties were swept away by revolution, war, and public rage, Britain's monarchy remained. It learned to retreat from power without relinquishing relevance, to exchange authority for symbolism, and to bind itself to the nation's identity rather than rule it outright. That achievement was neither accidental nor inevitable. It was engineered through discipline, sacrifice, and relentless self-control. But what it cost is less visible and far more human. What was lost was not land or title, but authenticity, intimacy, and freedom. Every generation paid that price again so the institution could endure. Love became conditional. Privacy became impossible. Individual desire was treated as a risk to be managed rather than a life to be lived. The monarchy survived by narrowing the emotional space its members were allowed to occupy. Time and again, the crown demanded restraint in moments when vulnerability might have healed. It preserved silence where honesty might have connected. It chose ritual over repair. These choices protected the institution, but they left scars that could not be ceremonially erased. The House of Windsor did not lose its crown. It lost something quieter and more enduring. The ability to exist without performance. Every smile, every marriage, every absence became symbolic. The people behind the titles were never allowed to be only themselves. They were required to carry history forward, regardless of the personal cost. And yet, endurance itself became the legacy. The monarchy remains, not because it is untouchable, but because it learned often painfully how to bend. Its greatest victories were never public triumphs, but avoided disasters. Its strength lies not in dominance, but in its willingness to surrender pieces of itself to remain standing. In the end, the story of the House of Windsor is a reminder that history's most durable institutions are rarely the happiest ones. Power and humanity do not fully coexist for long. One must eventually yield to the other. The crown survived. The family paid the price. And the world continues to watch, fascinated not by how long the monarchy has lasted, but by what it quietly gave up along the way.